Hey guys, this is Philosophossum, and since it's Black History Month, the theme is racism and race-related issues. So I was thinking earlier today, it's been a while since I've taken on Kyle Kulinski, so I figured it would be worth giving him a revisit, and I actually stumbled upon a video of his that was kind of interesting. It's a bit of a short video, it's just over 2 minutes long, and it's also one of his older videos. You can pretty much right off the bat tell this is one of his older videos. It features a noticeably younger version of Kulinski. It also takes place at a desk in his home as opposed to an actual studio, and he's using a noticeably lower quality camera. So very clearly this was early on in his YouTube career before his channel got real big. But the reason this rather short and old video caught my attention is for two reasons. One is that it sort of fits in with the theme I'm doing this month as it addresses racial discrimination, but it's also addressed directly at libertarians. I mean, he specifically mentions a user who goes by Spock Talk, but his question he's asking is directed towards libertarians in general. And well, since he's directly asking a question, I figured I'll directly provide an answer. So here you go, Kulinski. Now just a quick heads up before we get into the video. Since this video was uploaded over a decade ago with what appears to be a lower quality camera, the audio quality here isn't the best. I mean, it's not terrible, but it does noticeably crackle and fizz a little bit. I tried cleaning it up and editing a little bit to no avail, so just a little heads up there.
Okay, so this is a question for libertarians, in particular a user named Spock Talk.
So one of the big disadvantages to responding to older videos is that sometimes it can be difficult to track down some of the sources or other things referenced in the video. This particular video was uploaded 11 years ago, and a lot can change in that amount of time. Case in point, I was trying to track down this user he's referring to, Spock Talk, and I largely came up empty-handed. The closest thing I could find were videos from other users that referred to Spock Talk, but no videos from Spock Talk himself. So this channel was most likely deleted from YouTube for one reason or another. Now, it could be the case that he's out there somewhere on another platform. Maybe there's an archive of his videos somewhere I could look at. Like, if anyone out there watching this has any more information on this Spock Talk guy, by all means, if you could please leave something in the comments that could maybe help me track this guy down, I'd appreciate that. I've
watched a couple of his videos. While I may disagree with him on many things, I think he articulates his points well, and he's well read.
I will say it is very refreshing when I hear people actually being intellectually honest. Because, I'll do that too sometimes. I'll give someone kudos for making a good argument, even if it's an argument I disagree with. It gives much more of an impression of professionalism than when people just belittle and bash and act like assholes.
So I'm very interested to see what he thinks about this in particular. And it's a question regarding the recent controversy with Rand Paul. As everybody knows, he just got elected in Kentucky, and what's making liberals very anxious or weary of him, including myself, is...
I'd imagine there's quite a few reasons someone like Ron Paul would make liberals weary. Well, first of all, let's be honest, liberals get weary about all kinds of shit. It's not like making liberals feel weary is some kind of Herculean feat. But since liberals are the kind of people who want the government to do everything for us, and someone like Ron Paul is the kind of person who would directly challenge that viewpoint, I can see a whole multitude of reasons why that wouldn't bode well with liberals.
His recent statement that in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, while he may agree with a majority of the legislation...
I also agree with the majority of the legislation, as I'm sure most people do. You see, as I've mentioned in previous videos, it's a bit inaccurate to speak of being wholesale for or against the Civil Rights Act, because the Civil Rights Act is a bit of a complex piece of legislation. It's not a singular law that does a single thing, rather it's a series of laws that do a multitude of things. I do have to give Kulinski credit here for acknowledging this nuance, because it's a vital missing component from a lot of discussions about the Civil Rights Act. Oftentimes, whenever someone criticizes the Civil Rights Act, regardless of the capacity in which they're offering that criticism, they'll often be labeled a racist, when the conversation's a bit more complicated than that.
In that he doesn't think the public sector should in any way, shape, or form be able to discriminate. Right, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the public sector should be allowed to discriminate at all. This is actually for a multitude of reasons. The first reason is that the government's fundamental job is to try and serve the interests of society as a whole. If they're picking and choosing who to support, then they're not really doing their job. The other reason is that minorities pay taxes and are part of this society just as much as anyone else. So it makes sense then that they would deserve the same access to public services and the benefits of citizenship as do the rest of us.
he seems to dance around the question of should private businesses be able to say you can't be served here because of your skin color or something like that.
So in all fairness, this video was made a while ago, so there's a possibility that Ron Paul's opinion could have changed in the interim, but as of recently, he's been kind of firm and straightforward on what his stance is here. He personally doesn't agree with discrimination in the private sector, but still thinks it should be allowed, and with good reason. You see, at first it may seem inconsistent or hypocritical to be in favor of prohibiting discrimination in the public sector, but thinking it should be allowed in the private sector, but you have to understand that there are actually several key differences between the public and private sector, which makes such a distinction warranted. You see, the public sector is focused on serving the general welfare of society as a whole, while firms in the private sector are focused on serving specific customers to that firm. The public sector is also funded through taxation. Because the public sector is communally funded in a way that private organizations aren't, it makes sense that they would be communally accessible in a way that private organizations aren't. Also, public sector discrimination is a lot more difficult to deal with than private sector discrimination. If a private company is discriminating against somebody, that's fairly easy for them to deal with, as they can simply go to a competitor that won't. If the government decides to discriminate against you, you're really not left with many options. Also, the government banning public sector discrimination wouldn't actually violate the non-aggression principle, since this would simply amount to the government making rules internally for itself, the same way any private organization could. Also, the public sector includes anything that's funded or operated publicly, not just the government. So a privately owned organization could still be considered part of the public sector if it receives significant backing or funding from the government. This is why I believe it's legitimate for the government to say, as a condition of receiving public funding, you're not allowed to discriminate. And if a publicly funded business is caught discriminating, well, they should lose that public funding.
Open discrimination in the private sector, let's call it that.
I'm glad he specifically refers to open discrimination, because that touches on what I feel to be the Achilles heel of any sort of non-discrimination law, and that is that businesses that intend on discriminating most likely won't be open about it. Suppose a business owner doesn't want to hire blacks or gays or Jews or whatever. If someone from one of those groups were to apply for a job there, and their application were to get turned down because they're from that group, what are the odds that that business owner is going to tell them, I turned down your application because you're from that group? Most likely what would happen is they would turn you away for a discriminatory reason, but offer a different reason officially on record. And what are you going to do? They may very well be firing you or rejecting your application for a discriminatory reason, not for the reason they said, but good luck proving it.
Okay, now my question is, even for the most staunch libertarians.
So there's actually no such thing as a staunch libertarian or an extreme libertarian. Like, either you believe the initiation of force against innocent people is wrong or you don't.
Don't you think that even if this is the one exception to the government needs to stay out of private businesses?
Well, first of all, let's clarify what the libertarian position is on this issue exactly, because the way that Kyle here is phrasing it is kind of vague and esoteric. First of all, libertarians aren't against rules. We're against rulers getting to arbitrarily make rules for everybody, but not necessarily against there being rules. We of course believe in a non-aggression principle. We think it's wrong to interfere with the rights of other people or their property. Obviously, if a business is doing something that harms another person's right to their person or property, we would believe they should be held responsible for that. It's also important to point out that not all libertarians are anarchists. Plenty of libertarians do think there should be a government or some sort of organization in society who is responsible for enforcing the non-aggression principle. If a business does something that violates the non-aggression principle, like abuse somebody else's property, or steal from somebody, or defraud somebody, we wouldn't mind the government stepping in to adjudicate that. What we're against specifically is the government arbitrarily nosing in and sort of micromanaging all the businesses, sort of stepping beyond that role of a simple, neutral, passive arbitrator.
That there can be an exception.
So what Kyle is basically doing here is he's calling for an exception to the general principle that libertarians believe, which is that the government shouldn't be able to go micromanaging private businesses. So if someone's calling for an exception, we first have to understand the rule. Where does this sort of rule that libertarians don't want the government to micromanage private businesses, where does that sort of come from? Well, a business is a type of property. Now that includes both tangible property, such as the building and the equipment inside of it, and the intangible property, the time, effort, and labor that the business owner put into creating and maintaining that business. Now, property comes about as a result of your time and labor. Like if I go out in the woods, chop down a tree, carve out the wood, and make a chair out of it, my time and labor is what created that chair. Therefore, that would make it my chair. If someone else were to come along and take that chair from me or sit in it without my permission, they are essentially taking advantage of my time and labor against my will. Now, if I own something, that means it's mine to do with as I please. So if I chop down a tree and make a chair out of it, that chair is mine. I can sit on it, stand stand on it, light it on fire, whatever. The same goes for a property regarding a business. A business is simply a form of property that you let other people use for a living. So if I were to, for example, let people sit in my chair in exchange for a certain amount of money, that would be a business. So to summarize, the rule is that since you own your time and labor, you own the results of your time and labor, therefore you own your property. And a business is simply just a form of property that you let other people use in exchange for money. Now what Kyle is saying here is that there should be an exception to this rule. What he's saying is that there should be some portion or some extent to which someone else should be able to come in and dictate how you use your property or the results of your time and labor. Well, if someone else has the right to dictate how I use my property, that's essentially a claim to ownership over it, because the literal definition of owning something means to be able to exert one's will over it. If there's some extent to which someone else has the right to exert their will over something, then there's an extent to which that they own it. Because property is the result of your time and labor, and there's an extent to which they own your property, there's also an extent to which they own your time and labor. If somebody else owns your time and labor, that makes you a slave to them. Since there's an extent to which they own your time and labor, there's an extent to which you're a slave to them. Therefore, if there's an extent to which the government can dictate how you use your own property, there's an extent to which you're a slave to the government. And it would be different if there was some sort of agreement going on, like if you signed some sort of contract saying, I hereby agree to operate my business within these guidelines as part of some sort of arrangement that you voluntarily agree to, that would be okay. But if someone just tries to arbitrarily butt in and dictate how you use your property, that's not okay.
Where, yes, it is okay for the government to essentially play the rational parental figure.
You know, whenever I said leftists and authoritarians think that grown-ass adults need the government to be their babysitter, I usually meant that as a joke. Now Kyle Kulinski is just coming out and saying that he thinks the government should be a parental figure. Like it's no longer a straw man or a joke. Like the left actually thinks you're too stupid to run your own life, so you need the government to be your mom or your daddy. And nobody's necessarily saying the government can't be a rational figure of authority. You know, there's more to leadership than just bossing people around and demanding orders. One very important form of leadership is leading by example or being a good role model. Perhaps the government could encourage diversity and tolerance by practicing it itself. The government could say, hey, we're open and diverse and it works well for us and maybe it'll work good for your organization too. The government can also do things like I mentioned before, offer positive incentives like grants to businesses that don't discriminate. Just because I don't want the government to threaten somebody to do something against their will with a gun doesn't necessarily mean I don't think the government should do something to address the problem.
That says, you know what? No.
No. No. No. No.
You are not allowed to discriminate based on something arbitrary.
Well, I mean, who gets to decide what counts as arbitrary? I mean, the business owner has a worthwhile reason in mind why he's discriminating, otherwise he wouldn't be discriminating. What makes your reason for him not discriminating any more arbitrary than his reason for discriminating? What I think is arbitrary is the government's power to make rules for businesses it doesn't own. I mean, none of us get to do that. I don't get to go dictating what the rules are at my neighbor's house. I mean, where does the government get the magic right to make rules for other people's property that the rest of us don't seem to have?
And something that the person can't help. Somebody can't help if they're black or Asian and they're unable to be treated the same at a restaurant.
So here's the thing. If a business owner decides not to serve certain people because of their race or skin color or whatever, I agree that is actually pretty shitty. I think that's a pretty big dick move actually. But at the end of the day, it's their business. They get to make the rules. If you don't think it's fair, go to a different business that has different rules. Now, of course, a lot of you are probably thinking, well, Philosophossum, if you agree that that's actually a pretty shitty thing for them to do, then why do you think it should be allowed? Well, to put it simply, there are certain fundamental human rights that I believe are absolutely important, that I believe that any sort of curtailment of them, even with benevolent intentions, is the greater evil. I'll put it this way. The reason I support a business owner's right to discriminate is the same reason I support hate speech. If someone wants to say racist or hateful or bigoted things about a certain group of people, they should be allowed to do that. Now, do I agree with those types of views? Absolutely not. But I would still defend someone's right to say it because free speech is important. The same thing goes for free association. I do not in any way, shape, or form condone business discrimination. If I ever owned a business, I would never even entertain the possibility of turning someone away because of their skin color. But I still think that business owners should be allowed to discriminate because I think that free association is a fundamental human right. After all, forcing someone to associate with you or perform labor for you against their will is literally the definition of slavery. And if we accept the idea that exceptions can be granted towards fundamental rights when it's convenient or in line with somebody's interests, well, quite simply, they cease to be rights at that point. If I can just at any point arbitrarily decide that your right has exceptions to it, then it's no longer a right. Here's the beautiful thing about rights, though. though. They apply equally across the board to everybody. So while free speech might protect somebody's right to say hateful or bigoted things, equally protects your right to criticize it or speak out against it. Now by that same token, while it is true that free association means that certain business owners have the right to discriminate, it also protects your right not to support discrimination. Because free association means that businesses cannot force you to do business with them if you don't want to. Remember how I said that since your property comes about as a result of your hard work, you have the absolute right to decide what to do with it? Well, that doesn't just apply to business owners. It applies to you as well. Since you work hard to earn your money, it's yours, you decide how to spend it. So if business is doing something that you disagree with, such as discriminating based on race or something like that, you can decide not to support it by not going there. So I think there's a bit of sweet irony in the fact that the same freedoms and rights that protect certain forms of bigotry are at the same time also the best tools to fight against it. This also has to do with another point I mentioned earlier in the video. Remember how earlier I mentioned that the biggest Achilles heel of any sort of non-discrimination law is that it really only works if the business owner's being open with their discrimination? Believe it or not, society would actually have an easier time dealing with discrimination if it were open. Because if business owners were allowed to just come out and say, we don't serve blacks, we don't hire gays, whatever, we would all know who the bigoted business owners are and we would know not to patronize them. By forcing the discrimination underground, you're not necessarily getting rid of the discrimination. What you're doing is you're really just making it harder for us as a society to deal with it. Because like I said before, a business that doesn't want to hire black people isn't going to hire black people. They'll just deny their application and say it's for a different reason.
Because I feel like even if you're the staunchest libertarian...
I am the staunchest libertarian. I'm 100% and always against the initiation of force against innocent people. I'm an extremely staunch libertarian in the same way that I'm an extremely staunch non-murderer or non-rapist. Like if something is wrong, then it's wrong.
This is one of the examples where if you disagree with the government...
It's not necessarily that I disagree with the government. I mean, if the government says that it's bad for businesses to discriminate, then yeah, I agree with that. What I disagree with is that the only possible solution is for the government to come in with a gun to solve the problem. Like, I agree, if a business is deciding not to serve people of a certain group or skin color, that's not necessarily fair, but I would prefer some sort of a peaceful, non-violent solution to that problem.
You're really letting your ideology trump the better part of your rationality.
So yeah, the video just kind of cuts out there. Like, he doesn't really offer much in terms of an elaboration. He just ends it on the claim that we're letting our ideology trump rational thinking and just kind of leaves it at that, doesn't offer any sort of explanation. I think that's probably the biggest problem with this video. Kyle makes a lot of claims but doesn't really do much in terms of backing them up. As a matter of fact, the majority of what he does in this video is just engaging in a special pleading fallacy. Like, hey, you libertarians should make this exception to your principles. I'm not really going to go into detail explaining why you should make this exception, you just should. Yeah, saying that there should be an exception without explaining why is called special pleading. I mean, his reasoning seems to mostly boil down to appeal to emotion. I mean, the only real explanation he gives as to why libertarians should allow this government intrusion into the affairs of private businesses is because discrimination is shitty. Which, I mean, I agree, it is. But there's a lot of things that are shitty that people are still allowed to do. If you want us to agree with you that this is something that should be prohibited by the government, so we're going to need a little more of an explanation than that. Because I gave you a very thorough, logical explanation as to why free association is important and why discrimination should be allowed. So I guess the ball's in your court now. Come up with some sort of argument against that if you want to convince me that discrimination should not be allowed. Anyways, as always, this has been Philosophy Making Stupidity Play Dead. Take care.